Conditions for Jews in Germany were already very precarious. So many wanted to leave, but getting an exit visa meant leaving everything behind apart from a small amount of personal property and practically no money on exit. This also entailed getting an entry visa to a country willing to take you. Anyone without wealth, distinction, special expertise, or sponsored had little chance. Immigration to Palestine was strictly measured and enforced by Britain, who were anxious to appease their Arab friends. This drastically cut the numbers of ordinary families wanting to emigrate, but never able to fill the full necessary regulations. In desperation, people started crossing the German border with Czechoslovakia illegally. This way, they didn't wait for visas and took as much with them as they could. It was dangerous, but for many, worth the risk. They had to climb the mountain range, the Erzgebirge, that divides the two countries, and slip through that way. For that, they needed a mountain guide, and this is where my father comes into the story. Maccabi had a sports hut on the mountain range to provide shelter for their members when climbing or skiing. Groups of refugees met at this hut, and my father guided them over the border. He was one of the special couriers helping at that time. He was, however, betrayed and imprisoned. On his release in early 1938, he knew he had to flee, and we made the same journey over the mountains and found ourselves in Prague, desperate for a visa to anywhere. Living in Prague was not easy. My father desperately searched for ways to get to Palestine. Financially, money was running out, and with illegal status, work was impossible. Every day, the thousands besieging every embassy increased, begging, praying, hoping for salvation in the form of a visa to anywhere. Then the impossible happened. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, without a voice raised in disapproval. March 1939, the streets of Prague echoed to the sound of jackboots. It was obvious my father had to disappear before they came for him. He decided to flee to Poland to his unfortunate family, who had been deported from Zwickau with the Kristallnacht deportations and dumped on the Polish border. As Ostjuden, they were polluting Germany, and as refugees, the Polish population certainly didn't want them. There were thousands of them, and apart from the rampant anti-Semitism, there was no provision of food or shelter for so many. Added to this was the fear of the Nazi threat on the Polish border. So my father disappeared, and my mother was left alone in Prague with little money and two small children. She joined the endless queues every day at every embassy. The result was always the same. If she ever reached an official, they would ask the obvious questions. Did she have any special skills? No. Did she have a sponsor to vouch for her maintenance? No. What would she do with two small children in a country whose language she didn't speak? Oh, right. The deportations began. Swiftly and efficiently, streets were cleared of their Jewish inhabitants, and panic increased. Then suddenly my mother grasped at a last straw. The British Embassy decided to award 2 visas to the winners of a cookery competition. It gave anyone and everyone a chance. What could my mother lose? She cooked a traditional Friday night Shabbat meal and hoped for salvation. She won. It was now the end of August 1939. Late at night, there was a knock on our door. As a rule, it meant just one thing: deportation. There was an 8 p.m., 8 a.m. curfew, and no one was allowed out without risking death. This, however, was a woman's voice, and my mother let her in. She turned out to be a secretary from the British Embassy on a mission to save our lives. She gave my mother her British entry visa, train tickets to get through Czechoslovakia, then Holland, and the ferry to England, but had not been able to get us exit visas, giving us permission to leave Prague. We just had to take a chance and say we were visiting family if questioned. We could take no luggage that could look suspicious, only food and a few necessities. This was the first miracle. It was Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. As my foot touched the platform, it was 11 a.m. and there was a huge announcement on a loudspeaker. I, of course, did not understand what it was. The speaker was Chamberlain, telling the British people that Hitler had invaded Poland on September the 1st and Britain had given him an ultimatum. If he did not withdraw his troops by 11 a.m. on September the 3rd, Britain would declare war. This was the case, and as a result, Britain was now at war and the gates to freedom were closed.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
This was followed by an air raid siren being sounded, and the Jewish Refugee Committee, waiting for people like us, took us first to an air raid shelter and then to a hostel for women and children in Stamford Hill. There were a number of these hostels with separate facilities for men. The following day, my mother took a paper with my father's details and his photo, hoping to leave it in one of the men's hostels for the possibility that someone might have come across him. Knocking on the door of the first hostel, a man opened it. It was my father. He had managed to get to Poland, where he found his family in their original village, living in terrible circumstances, with little food and less money. He himself was a fugitive and had no means of helping them. He decided that the only way was for him to get to a free country and find a way of bringing them over. At the same time, he had to try and find out what was going on in Prague. He heard there was a ship sailing from the Balkans for political refugees, not necessarily Jews. As he'd been imprisoned for political activities against the Reich, he was able to get on board. There were about 1,000 men, including President Beneš of Czechoslovakia. When this ship reached the English Channel, it was too big to enter it, so apparently the men were divided into 3 groups, alphabetically. The first group would go to England, the second group to France — Hitler will never come to France — and the third group stayed on the ship and sailed to Canada. My father, Jakob Biron, was with the first group and arrived in London. It was July 1939. He now had to find a way to communicate with his wife and children and bring them to safety. The days were a nightmare. Whatever he tried was in vain. One day he heard the newspaper vendor shouting, "England in danger! England in danger!" Unable to read the paper, he asked someone to tell him what had happened. Sick with grief, he could not believe the news. The disaster was that England were in danger of losing the Ashes to the West Indies. For the uninitiated, this is cricket. We cannot imagine what his thoughts were when he tried to understand this source of anxiety. So now here we were together again, saved in a miraculous way.